Ridley Scott's masterpiece science fiction horror film, brilliantly set to a classical score by Jerry Goldsmith, and with Scott's tight film noir style camera work, it is the benchmark film of its genre, perhaps surpassed only by John Carpenter's The Thing. The story begins 50 years ago. John Carpenter and Dan O'Bannon collaborated on a student project, Dark Star. This delightfully silly film features a fractious crew, a malfunctioning artificial intelligence system, an indifferent ship's computer, and of course an escaped alien life form. Dark Star initially performed poorly in the cinema. O'Bannon reworked his script to a much darker, far more serious film that evolved into Alien. The Alien franchise is an example of where writers have stumbled upon something interesting scientifically, providing that the later writers don't mess around with the central idea too much. Alien introduces us to such concepts as artificial gravity and faster-than-light travel that doesn't cause all the stars to go all crinkly or have engines of infinite power to push infinite mass. Sagely, O'Bannon avoids any explanation of how these might work. What's going on with the biology here? I first saw the film when I was 17. I thought, wow, what an amazing film! I was reasonably well versed in the biological sciences as a prelude to studying medicine. I thought, how did this creature evolve? We had to wait over 30 years until Alien Covenant to find out. Essentially, the xenomorph, or xenomorph in American, is a parasitoid life form, one that kills its host. It consists of a larval stage, the facehugger, and an adult stage which grows in and emerges from the host's lungs. There are a considerable number of real parasitoids. The most similar is the emerald cockroach wasp. The wasp will sting a cockroach, specifically aiming at two key neural ganglia. This distorts the roach's behaviour so its normal fight or flight response is distorted. The wasp then lays an egg on the carapace. This hatches and the larva burrows into the cockroach from within, eventually emerging as an adult wasp from the corpse. In many ways, this is a far more terrifying parasite than the xenomorph. Unlike the relatively rigid framework of physics and chemistry, the biological sciences allow almost anything to happen, given enough time. Cockroaches have been around for 300 million years or so. Sooner or later, a specialist parasite was going to evolve. How does the facehugger locate the host's mouth? According to Alien Romulus, they use sound and heat signatures. However, Kane, the first victim, is wearing a spacesuit. Presumably his helmet visor would have been heated in the right place by exhaled air. Why does the facehugger implant the embryo in the lungs and not the abdomen or something easier to break out of? The hugger ambushes its host and is in a tearing hurry to subdue its victim. It will opt for the larger tube, the trachea, rather than the esophagus. These are quite often mixed up in medicine during intubation or nasogastric tube feeding. There would presumably be occasions when the embryo is implanted in the stomach. How does the growing embryo evade detection and destruction by the immune system? There are a whole variety of parasites that can do exactly that. Helminth worms subtly mess with the reactivity of the immune system. The normal response to pathogens is a complex dance of white blood cells to release antibodies. However, parasitic worms release cytokine chemical messengers which act to detune T cells, which detect and react to foreign proteins. They become less sensitive to the worm. The COVID-19 virus involved a similar trick in detuning the immune system using interleukin-3. The embryo grows in the lungs. It doesn't reach a size where it squashes the heart or lungs before it bites or punches its way out of the ribcage. However, the xenomorph grows to a prodigious size within hours. How does that work? One possible explanation is that the alien really isn't all that alien at all and shares the Earth's biochemistry. It uses DNA and proteins. The newborn xenomorph carries with it a store of protein, absorbed from the host. No wonder Kane was so hungry when he woke up. It's a little unclear how the juvenile stage turns into an adult. Alien Romulus shows a pupa for the metamorphosis, yet earlier films have shed skins. This brings us to our next puzzle. How can protein-based blood vessels hold acidic blood that can melt through metal and plastic? Acids work by adding hydrogen ions into substances, which generally causes their structure to collapse. pH is a measure of how readily acids donate hydrogen. Our own stomachs hold hydrochloric acid up to around a pH of 1.5. Its effects are held at bay by a whole range of biochemical defense measures. According to Rook, the deranged robot in Alien Romulus, the blood is a mixture of fluoroantimonic acid and sulfuric acid. I would suspect the latter was only chucked in as the only strong acid the audience would have likely to have heard of. By comparison to fluoroantimonic acid, it's quite weak. Oddly, this substance can be contained with Teflon.
The xenomorph's blood, therefore, isn't quite as ridiculous as it first sounds. It is plausible to have an organic containment for a highly acidic substance. We can imagine Teflon-like platelets to send bleeding from injuries. However, how it carries oxygen or where it gets the fluorine from is quite unclear. The xenomorph is extremely aggressive, but it never seems to eat its victims, despite having a double set of fearsome teeth. The answer is provided by the next film in the series. Aliens, directed by James Cameron, is a masterwork of storytelling and is that rare thing, a sequel that is better than the utterly brilliant original. With 156 colonists to play with, the xenomorphs could fulfill their potential as a nest resembling social insects. Normally, new queens in a hive are created by feeding the standard larvae a different diet. This acts as a gene activation cascade. How this could have occurred in a brand new hive is unclear. Perhaps the firstborn xenomorph becomes a queen if it senses it has enough hosts for its offspring. There is also the problem of protein economy. How did the queen grow to such a size and lay so many eggs if it never eats anything? It might be that the ordinary xenomorph drones eat the remains of the dead colonists and feed them to the queen, presumably spitting out the electronic ID tags. They gather and entrap colonists ready for embryo implantation. We see one of the key rules of biology. Creatures generally generate far more offspring than would normally survive in the hope the conditions might become favourable in future. The queen lays far more eggs than colonists in the hope that more people will come along. There is only one quibble I have with Aliens, which is when the dropship falls out from underneath the USS Sulaco, propelled presumably by the ship's artificial gravity field. It then fires its rocket engines in the direction of travel. This would cause the ship to accelerate and push it into a higher orbit, and therefore slow down relative to the planets and the Sulaco. It needs a retrofire to drop it into the atmosphere.
From this point on, things start falling apart. The franchise began to drift away from the excellent writing and direction of O'Bannon, Scott and Cameron. Having established a set of biological behaviour for the xenomorphs, subsequent writers just sort of tossed the rulebook away. Alien 3 has a strong, mainly British cast, who are subsequently wasted in a lumpy plot with poor visual effects and extremely sloppy science. Having shed its egg-laying abdomen, the queen somehow lays 2 eggs inside the dropship. These hatch without the movement stimulus that prompted previous eggs. The facehuggers wander around inside the USS Sulaco, locating and infecting Ripley despite being in suspended animation. The hugger clumsily injures itself, leaks acid into the ship's electrical system, which then ignites. Generally, the worst thing that can happen on a spaceship is for it to catch fire. You would have thought that by the late 22nd century, military spacecraft would have a proper automated fire control system, rather than moving the cryopods into an emergency escape vehicle. This occurred presumably at supralight speed. The module's method of deceleration wasn't shown, but it must have had one, as a collision with the planet would have produced a spectacular nuclear explosion. The module was aimed at the nearest inhabited planet. It ploughed into Fury 161 at absurd speed, killing all but Ripley and the other facehugger, which was rather improbably hidden away somewhere. The rest of the film proceeds more or less sensibly, except for having 2 Y chromosomes doesn't make men more violent. It's just a spare copy. Sadly, the exquisite puppet work for the xenomorph's movements was spoilt by poor Matty integration with the background. The less said about Alien Resurrection, the better, which was singularly awful from a scientific perspective. However, it did establish one key plot element that will be crucial later. Efforts to build a human-alien hybrid imply that, as we suspected, it's not all that alien at all, and it shares most of the biochemistry of Earth, including DNA. Alien vs. Predator, on the other hand, was tremendous fun, a sort of Alien meets Predator meets Tomb Raider with Indiana Jones. However, I'll ignore this film as it's not really part of the franchise's narrative.
By the early 2000s, Scott regained control of the franchise and set it on an entirely different course. Prometheus explores both the origins of life and that of the xenomorph. However, it starts going wrong more or less from the opening scene. An engineer sacrifices himself on an Earth-like planet to seed it with life. However, the early Earth was very un-Earth-like. It was cold, dark, and spun at a great rate of knots, with a huge moon in the sky generating enormous tides. It had no oxygen and was bathed in ultraviolet radiation.
Yet somehow or other, the earliest bacteria evolved 3.7 billion years ago. So if this wasn't the Earth, then where was it? And how is this relevant to the narrative? The scientists discover evidence that the engineers visited the Earth in Paleolithic times. They set off on coordinates found in a cave in the Isle of Skye. to discover that the human DNA and that of the engineers is identical.
There are several problems with this idea. Deoxyribonucleic acid, or DNA, is a self-replicating molecule that makes occasional copying errors. The information contained in it codes for proteins. These proteins build cells, and their shape is altered due to the copying errors, or mutations. This process is the driving engine of evolution. If DNA made perfect copies every time, life would have never progressed beyond whatever came before bacteria. However, most of the sequence of DNA is concerned with the making of standard proteins and enzymes that are common to all life. It is often said that 60% of the human genome is identical to that of a banana. There is a very good reason for that, since bananas and humans share a common ancestry and biochemistry. The ancestors of the engineers could not have seeded the early Earth with cells containing DNA, since bananas, mammals, and engineers all rely on aerobic respiration. They all use oxygen. This only appeared in Earth's atmosphere billions of years later, largely due to cyanobacteria slowly poisoning their anaerobic relatives.
However, if we ignore all these difficulties, Prometheus is actually a perfectly reasonable film. I like to turn the whole idea on its head and assume the engineers were an early hominid species that developed a spacefaring civilization a few 100,000 years ago. They were in the process of an all-too-human activity of returning to exterminate their upstart Homo sapien cousins.
The most interesting idea here is the black goo substance that seems to act as an accelerant for gene expression and mutation. Evolution occurs very slowly, mostly. Random variations in gene expression produce slightly different characteristics. This may allow an organism to survive an environmental change slightly better than their fellows. Some creatures like cockroaches, crocodiles and sharks seem to have reached a state of perfection and are ideally adapted to weather any catastrophe. They have remained unaltered for hundreds of millions of years. But what if you could deliberately accelerate these random variations? This can occur by two methods. Firstly, changing the base pair sequence in a gene alters the type or the shape of the protein produced by that gene. These proteins can build all of the structure of the body and all of the enzymes and hormones that make it work. The other method is by gene activation or epigenetics. Normally, dormant genes can be switched on by a cascade of proteins and enzymes. Normally, genetic changes only occur in the organism's offspring, which is why evolution tends to be rather slow, depending on the lifespan of the creature. In the 1990s, I played about with ideas of combining nanotechnology with biochemistry. I devised a self-replicating nanocomputer capable of producing proteins for artificial gene expression. Scott's goo seems to serve a similar purpose, a programmable gene expression system. Let loose without programming, the goo starts to modify the humans in unpredictable ways. One of the scariest scenes in the film is where Elizabeth Shaw performs a C-section to remove a peculiar squid-like creature. I would, however, object to the abdominal closure procedure. Given the number of structures that need to be cut through, chucking a few staples in to seal it up really isn't going to work. The rectus abdominis in particular needs time to repair and heal. It would be very unlikely she'll be able to stand up, let alone run away from a crashing spaceship.
The sequel, Alien Covenant, didn't perform as well, reaching only 6.4 on IMDb. However, I liked it. It provided the answer to the question posed by the very first film. How did this creature evolve?
The answer is, it didn't. It was created by David, a deranged android tinkering with the engineer's goo. The goo's default setting was to create a creature resembling the xenomorph, presumably as a weapon system. David adapted this design to create the species we know from earlier films.
On the whole, Alien Romulus works well. It is the film that Alien Resurrection should have been, but wasn't. Fede Alvarez and his team worked very hard to incorporate the various bits and pieces of previous films into a perfectly reasonable sequel. There is a curious parody where Rook is reactivated. This was achieved by a CGI model of the late Ian Holm. Rook fills in a number of details missing from earlier films, such as the nature of the blood and the sense of the larval and adult stages. But then he stumbles and talks complete nonsense by saying that the embryo combines with the DNA of its host. While bacteria often swap bits of DNA, this is a risky strategy for any multicellular organism. Its genes will be quickly washed of the characteristics that enabled the creatures to survive in the first place. Two physics quibbles here. If the artificial gravity is switched on every few minutes, objects are not going to be floating around without any impetus, particularly if the air vents are switched off.
The intersection with the ring plane would probably have been far more spectacular in reality. Bits of ice would fly off in all directions while the station would start to spin due to the off-axis force of collision at the bottom.
Alien's creators made a plausible species using some basic principles from the biological sciences. It works very well as a plot device to create some of the most iconic science fiction films of the last 50 years. All should go well for future spin-offs, providing the writers are not allowed to mess with O'Bannon's original concept. I would suggest seeing the forthcoming TV series and see if anything leaps out at you.